Climate Change from a Catholic and a Personal Perspective is the title. And I'm going to give you a brief science. I'm not going to talk much about the science, but I'll get into my career experience because I was really fortunate in my career. I got to work in the Arctic and seen some changes there. Personal experience, after I retired, I became a scuba diver, and there's some changes going on there. And then the faith perspective, that's what Laudato Si really emphasized to me and made me see things in a different light. And what you can do, you know, it's really not hopeless. It can sound hopeless at times, but it's really not. So, you know, visible threats. I think one of the things that we kind of all can agree on is that, you know, plastics and a lot of the things that you know, everybody's heard about the garbage patches in the Pacific, and there's a couple of huge ones, one in the Western Pacific and one in the Eastern Pacific. And you know it's really amazing how bad that looks, and that we've done that to our planet. That's one of the things that the Pope talks about in his encyclical. It's a picture from National Geographic. One of the things, though, is that we have an invisible threat, and it's CO2. And it's hard to fathom the problem because CO2 is odorless, and you know, it's needed. You know, it's something that plants require for photosynthesis. But what's happened is, and you've probably all seen this before, is this is the measurements of CO2 from Mauna Loa, the mountain in Hawaii, and it's just gone steadily up virtually since the start of the Industrial Revolution. But this shows it since the beginning of measurements in 1960. So basically, there's 50% more CO2 in the atmosphere right now than has existed for the last 800,000 years. And those measurements are pretty accurate because they come from ice cores. So there's a fossil fuel conundrum here. And I'm not going to, I tried to let Katharine Hayhoe describe this because she's a much better communicator than I am. I don't know if you've ever seen any of her stuff, but she's a very, very well-known scientist. She's the director of Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University. She's the lead author of the 4th National Climate Assessment Report back in November. She's also a lead author on IPCC and a number of other publications. She's a very devout evangelical Christian, gives a number of talks related to climate, related to her faith, and over 120 peer-reviewed papers. So she's a very, but she's also an incredible communicator. So I'm going to show you an excerpt from a global weirding video series that she puts out, and there are about 40 episodes out now.
Fossil fuels are terrible. If I could get in a time machine and go back to the 1700s, I'd do everything I could to make sure the Industrial Revolution never happened, right? This may shock you, but I'm going to say it anyways. I am grateful for the progress fossil fuels have enabled us to make. Without them, I'd be living a life that was far shorter and much more miserable. In fact, without the medical advances that have come with our progress, I'd very likely be dead already. And I don't know about you, but I like electricity and technology and being able to visit interesting parts of the world through the miracles of travel and television and the internet, all things that have now become commonplace thanks to energy from fossil fuels. I think it's appropriate to acknowledge and be grateful for the benefits that coal and gas and oil have brought us. But what we know today that we didn't know all that much about 300 years ago is that they also have significant drawbacks. A big price tag attached, in fact, and that price is coming due.
Okay. So that is a backdrop. You know, I worked in the oil industry, and we get vilified a lot, and like it's our fault. But actually, everything, if you look around your house or any place, everything we have, our whole standard of living, has been because of fossil fuels. So it's been an incredible blessing. But there's a backside to this. So that's why I'm going to get into the brief science. So we know the impact of our atmosphere. If you take a look at the moon has no atmosphere. So, and the temperature on the moon, on the bright side, is plus 224, and on the back side, on the dark side of the moon, is almost minus 300. So the average temperature on the moon is minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, okay, we know our temperature on the Earth is not averaging minus 37. It's probably about, I think it's 70 or 80 degrees warmer than that. The reason for that is that beautiful blanket that we have around the planet, our atmosphere, and the greenhouse effect. So, and then from a perspective of some scale, if you go from Spring down to Galveston, Texas, you know that drives about 60 miles, right? Well, if you could drive vertically 60 miles, you could get up to what's called the Kármán line, which is the definition of the boundary between the Earth's atmosphere and outer space. So that gives you, I mean, 24,000 miles, I think, is the circumference of the Earth. That gives you an idea of the onion skin, and it's a very finite layer that protects us from outer space, the elements of outer space. It really is an onion skin of protection, and it's not infinite like many people think, that we can keep putting carbon dioxide into it and things won't change. So what happened? The Industrial Revolution happened, which is why we have the standard of living we have today. 1860, that's when coal, it's back in the UK. They started mining coal on a big way, and then the United States, and then oil and gas kicked in around 1910, 1920. You can see how the millions of metric tons produced by these various fuels over time, up to about 10 years ago. So, and this almost mirrors population, by the way, if you take a look at this graph. So as we became more affluent, and we also grew greatly in population. But what happened is that this disrupted the atmospheric CO2 equilibrium that we had. So we started producing excess, and that's what's causing our problems today. So where does the CO2 go? The world today produces about 37 billion metric tons of CO2, and 35% of that is absorbed by the soil and plants through photosynthesis, or 35%. 40% remains in the atmosphere. This is one of the problems. And basically, CO2 doesn't, like, over time break down into carbon and oxygen. It stays as CO2. It's a very stable gas, and it can remain in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Part of it, 25% of it, goes into the ocean, and that's absorbed by the ocean and makes carbonic acid, and is causing acidification. I'm not going to get into that, but that's another problem. So I thought about this from a family context, okay? And this is kind of a graph of the Industrial Revolution with superimposed birthdays of 6 generations of my family. It goes back to my great-grandmother was born around 1860-ish. And my grandmother was born just before the turn of the century. Then there's my mom in 1923, and me in 55, and my daughter and my beautiful granddaughter who was born in 2015. So anyway, you see the buildup of CO2 that's happened over that time period in the blue, and the temperatures superimposed on there have done, almost mirrored it. This is not a smooth curve, but it shows the variation, because there's a lot of factors that affect the temperature. Well, one of the things to keep in mind is the historic CO2 level. This is basically the level from the time of Abraham to 1900. It ranged between about 300 and 260, okay? So that's more or less human history, because back then there was probably about 1 million people on the planet to now almost 8 billion. And this, I also plotted on here, the world's population, basically at all of our birthdays. So you can see this is all tied together. But as Catherine Hayhoe says, this basically is all tied together in the sense of this is the prosperity of the world, but it also shows what happens when we don't appreciate some of the problems that CO2 creates. So from a faith context, the future, what does this kind of mean to me? This is my daughter and son baptizing our grandson. But every living person today and all future generations will be profoundly impacted by climate change. That statement can't be refuted. I mean, climate change is a life issue. I mean, plain and simple. So, tying to my career experience, the Arctic, I was really fortunate. I spent 33 years at Mobil and then ExxonMobil. And part of my job was as an Arctic geotechnical engineer. I got to go up onto the ice on an icebreaker back in 1987. Our objective was to gather sea ice data. The picture on the bottom left is all the scientists. It was a joint venture between scientists and some in the oil industry. We went up there to gather cores and get temperatures of the ice and take measurements how fast it's moving, because as an industry, we had to know how much load and stuff was going to go into platforms or anchoring systems. We had to come up with concepts to safely develop oil up there. And so I was really lucky to go up on this. It's incredibly beautiful up there. But in 1987, when I went, there are two shots here. One, 1987, you can see that to get to the North Pole is roughly about 1,300 miles from the North Slope of Alaska. It took us, in September is the largest open water, that's the end of summer. We had to go about 60 miles to hit the edge of the ice, and that little yellow, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
That little yellow dot is roughly where that picture came from. That's where we were taking measurements. And so there was about 60 miles of open water. Fast forward to 2018, you can see the thickness and the disappearance of the ice. You now have to go 500 miles to hit the ice in September. Okay, so the ice coverage and multi-year ice are disappearing. Ice coverage is its lowest since satellite monitoring started in 1979, and all the historical records that go back to the 1800s. And it could be ice-free in September as soon as 2030. So this is basically, if you took geology, this is what we're seeing now is geologic change over like my lifetime. That's not supposed to happen. Geologic changes like this happen over like millennia. And so this has to really cause people concern. And the last time the Arctic was ice-free, modern humans did not exist. It was over 200,000 years ago. So what I'm going to show you is a video of the change in the ice coverage. I'm just going to give you, we're going to be looking, it's a time lapse looking down at the top of the Earth, created by NASA. But the oldest ice is the white, it's the oldest and thickest, and the seasonal ice is blue. You're going to see the kind of the change in the ebb and the flow of the ice cover in the wintertime and the summertime. And I'll just let the video show itself, but one thing to watch, over a 35-year period, we've lost 75% of the volume of ice. There's no audio to this, so I'll do a few descriptions as we go through. It's about a minute long. So up in the left-hand corner, you can see how quickly the time lapse is moving. And up in the right-hand corner, you see that the oldest ice and the thickest ice is white, and the blue is, you can see kind of how that changes seasonally. And through the 90s, that was when I was still active in the Arctic. And there, we obviously were monitoring things like this because we wanted to understand the ice cover. But it really, up until 2004 is about the last time I was doing any Arctic projects. So watch what happens to the white. The ice thickness when I started my career was a maximum about 150 feet thick.
Wow.
And that's because it rafts on top of each other. That means that there are ridges that were that thick, and the whole thing was not that thick. But this is what shocked me. I mean, this blew me away. The multi-year ice, the white, is disappearing. And that's one of, it was several things that got me involved. But when I saw this video, that was like, this is very, very serious.
It's 9 o'clock.
We have Stephen Hawking telling us what time it is.
Thank you, Stephen.
Okay. So, I then also had some personal experience, and that's related to scuba. And I started scuba diving in 2013. Incredible marine diversity. I typically go down the Gulf of Mexico to Cozumel. Thousands of species, coral and sponges. I love taking pictures and so forth and videos. And then it's a symbiotic ecosystem. In other words, everything relies on each other. And this is a picture of parrotfish. And I picked a parrotfish because they live on coral. They eat coral. So when they eat coral, what comes out the back end ends up becoming coral sand. So basically, when you're on a coral sand beach, you have parrotfish to thank for that.
Yeah.
You can imagine they've been around for millennia.
Mm.
But as I'm scuba diving, I've never been to the Great Barrier Reef, but people I've been diving with would talk about the coral bleaching that's going on there recently. This is a healthy reef. This is from National Geographic. You can just see the variety and colors and spectacular nature of the underwater world. And this is what a bleached coral reef looks like. And this happens virtually overnight. It doesn't take long at all. And if you want to see a really good documentary, watch Chasing Coral on Netflix. It'll show you the whole process of how this happens. Anyway, reef decline. This gives you a perspective. Great Barrier Reef is shown in this picture in the upper right-hand northeast side of Australia. In area, it's about the same size as Italy or Japan. And it's about as long, you can see it from space, it's about as long as the East Coast of the United States. So it's a very significant, it's basically the Amazon of the underwater world. And bleaching is correlated to warm water stressing the corals. And mass bleaching events happened starting in 1998. And you can see the other years, but it really became severe in 2016, 2017. And 2014 to 18 have been the hottest on record. So here's the hottest years on record, and all of them have happened since 1998. 50% of the Great Barrier Reef was bleached in just 2 years, 2016 and 2017. That's mind-boggling. That's basically saying half the area of Germany, the trees and the plants and the animals have all disappeared over a 2-year period. That would be the correlation if it was on land. And the world's reefs around have declined significantly over the last 30 years. Basically, we've lost about 50% of the coral reefs around the world. Not quite as spectacularly as has happened in Australia, but it's been very closely tied to the increasing temperature of the water. So it represents ecosystem collapse, and that's important from a world standpoint because a lot of the population gets their protein from fish. So why does it matter to me? Well, this is my grandson, Dante. He's kind of a wingnut. I love him to death. But my grandson was born in 2013. Every year after his birthday, it's been the hottest on record. Every single year, he's 7 years old, has been the hottest on record. This doesn't show 2019 and 2020, but they're also in the top 5. 2020 right now we're tracking to be the hottest on record. And so that puts it in a different perspective for me. I mean, every year since he's been born has been the hottest on record. And I want to scuba dive with him someday. And I don't know what's going to happen. Sorry. So I want to bring this into a faith perspective. So the Catholic Church has been really vocal. And it goes back a long ways. It's not just recently with Pope Francis. If you go back to Pope Paul VI, due to an ill-considered exploitation of nature, humanity runs the risk of becoming in turn a victim of this degradation. And you go to St. John Paul II, he said in 1990, the greenhouse effect, climate change, has now reached crisis proportions. Keep in mind, this is 1990. As a consequence of industrial growth, massive urban concentrations, vastly increased energy needs. And at the last sentence is, I want to repeat that ecological crisis is a moral issue. To ignore it is not something that Catholics should be doing. Pope Benedict then came along. By the way, he's known as the Green Pope. He installed solar panels at the Vatican. So a good portion of the power from the Vatican comes from panels put up there by the Pope. And he said in 2010, how can we separate or even set at odds the protection of the environment and the protection of human life? Protection of the environment, I mean, this is a life issue, even though it's not really discussed in that sense. And then Pope Francis this is the week, it's 5th anniversary of his encyclical, Laudato Si. It was signed May 24th, 5 years ago. And he did not go off in a corner and write this, with the input directly from the Holy Spirit. He was advised by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. The Academy dates back to the 16th. It's the world's oldest scientific organization. And many Nobel laureates and have been a member of the Pontifical Academy, and actually 70 since 1902. And the book isn't just about climate change. It's about a lot of different things, about conspicuous consumption and many different things that we're not doing very well on, but it does talk about climate. And the consensus in the document is that climate change is real. This is caused in significant part by humans. I don't really think, back when he wrote this in 2015, I think there were a lot of people still debating that. I don't really think there's a debate on that anymore. So why does this matter to me? So I've got 3 beautiful daughters who've given Debbie and me 4 beautiful grandkids. And by the way, we've got 1 more on the way. She's due in July. Well, they are also going to have families, right? And so the question for me, Laudato Si, paragraph 159, really struck a chord. The world is a gift we have freely received and must share with others. The environment is on loan to each generation, which must then hand it on to the next. So that pretty much says it all to me. But I know this, and up to this point, it's kind of been gloom and doom, but honestly, there really is hope. And I'm going to talk about Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm a member. I've been a member for about 4 years. I'm not saying to become, you need to become a member, but I'm saying that I like the approach that they're taking. It's a volunteer-driven group founded a little over 10 years ago. Here's it's close to 200,000 members right now around the world. We have over 1,000. We're approaching 1,100 in the Woodlands alone. And so back in 2015 was the first meeting of about 2 people, and we're now at about 1,100. Our district is Texas 08. It's Kevin Brady's district. By the way, he's Catholic, goes to St. Simon and Jude. I've been to his office several times, and not had a face-to-face with him on the topic, but I've certainly talked to his office on numerous occasions. Our core belief, first, we're strictly bipartisan. People are good, democracy works. If you don't think people are good and democracy works, it's really, then it is hopeless. But, and I also really, one of the reasons I'm a member is because it's strictly bipartisan. We really don't talk about Republican and Democrat issues. We talk about getting our bill through Congress. And we have a laser focus on carbon fee and dividend approach solution. I'm going to hopefully describe that briefly for you. So here's the solution, and it's a bill that was introduced, our bill was introduced in January 2019, and it's presently in committee. Of course, it's not really getting much attention now because of the climate, or because of the pandemic, but this is the approach of the bill. It places a fee on fossil fuels at the source. A fee is basically a tax, but we call the fee because the money doesn't go to the government, and I'll explain that. But the fee is charged at $15 a ton of CO2 emitted. So if you produce coal or oil or gas or anything that puts CO2 in the atmosphere, a tax is assessed at the wellhead. So it enters the full economic pie, not just the transportation sector, not just the building sector or any. It's the full economic pie. It doesn't pick and choose winners. That $15 a ton of CO2 is about, I think, 10 to 12 cents per gallon of gas, to give you an idea. So it's not something that starts out huge, but it does go up over time at $10 per ton per year. So that's the whole purpose, is not to shock the economy. The unique thing is, though, that all the revenue comes back to households. You have to pay the government to run the thing, but that's only like 1% to 2% of the money collected the first year. And the revenues return to households. So how does that make sense? People with high carbon footprints, let's say you drive 2 huge SUVs and keep your house at 50 degrees, have a 5,000 square foot home, you keep it at 50 degrees in the summertime, you're going to be burning a lot, you're going to be paying a lot in, but you're going to get back, it comes back at a per capita basis. So you're getting the same check back as someone who lives in an apartment, rides their bike to work, and they make money, and you're going to lose money, But what that means is that it's going to give an incentive for people with a high carbon footprint for changing their behavior. And also gives a price function for entrepreneurs to then start developing additional or even carbon sequestration for companies that pump the CO2 into the ground from burning gas or whatever, then they get paid for that. So it's a way to quickly reduce carbon consumption in an equitable way. So, and the third thing of the bill is there's a border adjustment. So we have to have a level playing field. Now I use the example of, like, let's say Indonesia imports a barrel of oil to the United States and they don't have a tax. Well, they pay the tax at the border then, and that money comes to our people, doesn't go back to Indonesia. Or if we have a oil company that exports a barrel to Indonesia, they get that tax back. I mean, so they can sell and not be at a disadvantage. This is meant so that we don't export jobs overseas. It keeps a level playing field. So shortly after our bill came out, here's what was in the Wall Street Journal. It was an op-ed, and it was endorsed by over 3,400 US economists, all 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve that were alive. Paul Volcker has since passed away, but you can see the 4 of them there, 27 Nobel laureates, et cetera. So basically a who's who of economists. And this is what they said. Carbon tax is the most cost-effective means to reduce carbon emissions in the scale and speed necessary. The tax should increase every year until emissions goals are met. That's exactly what our bill does. To protect US competitiveness, a border carbon adjustment should be established. That's also exactly what's in our bill. Number 4, to maximize fairness and political viability, revenue should be returned to US citizens, also in our bill. And by the way, the most vulnerable will benefit. So the Catholic Church has actually come out. They haven't endorsed the bill, but they have, there's several bishops that have come out and support the concept. And Canadian leading economists agree. And this was a really nice short, I'm going to show you a short video of what they say.
Of course it can.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's essential.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. We? Yes, but you got to do it right. Right now, we raise almost no revenues from pricing pollution, and we raise almost all of our revenues from taxing the things that we actually want more of, like income and jobs and profits and the fruits of innovation. So what we need to do is turn that around. We need to raise more of our revenue by pricing pollution, and we need to raise way less of our revenue from taxing the things we like. By pricing pollution, you will actually create incentives to reduce pollution, and that's pollution that's costing us money today. So doing it right means you need a simple and a transparent price on various kinds of pollution. And that price in place provides ongoing incentives for reducing pollution and for innovation that's good for the economy. But then you take the revenues from the pollution pricing and you recycle it back into the economy to generate further benefits. So you can reduce corporate income taxes, you can reduce personal income taxes, you can help vulnerable families, you can finance critical infrastructure, you can finance clean tech. But there's lots of benefits there, different benefits for different governments.
One thing he didn't say was that you could send that money back to the people, and that's what our approach does. So, and then this is something you probably don't know about, but I think because it didn't get much attention, but it should have. Pope Francis had an energy summit in 2018 and 2019. It's called the Vatican Dialogues, the Energy Transition and Care for a Common Home, once again tying to Laudato Si. Energy and investment company leaders were invited from all around the world. CEOs only. This is interesting. If you could not send a substitute, if you wanted to attend this meeting, you had to be the top person in the company, or in your direct reports. And over 30 major corporations attended. So you're saying, who attended this thing? Well, take a look. The list is on the left, but I picked some of the more significant ones and show them on the right. And you'll recognize some really big names. BlackRock is a huge investment company. ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron. I mean, and most of these have very large offices in Houston. So these people didn't go over there for an hour or two. They had to go over for a couple of days with the Pope. What did he say to, what did he tell these CEOs? Climate change threatens the very future of the human family. He basically read them the Riot Act. It's remarkable. The Pope said the poor will suffer the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Our children, this is the one that really just blows me away. Our children and grandchildren should not have to pay the cost of our generation's irresponsibility. I think that's amazing. And then carbon pricing is essential if humanity is to use the resources of creation wisely. So the Pope is saying you need to take a market-based approach, which is the way our bill is, to the problem, which that's also remarkable. So there's the people that attended. And what did they say after the end of the June summit last year? We recognize a significant acceleration of the transition to a low carbon future beyond current projections requires sustained large scale action. Undeniably, the Earth is a single system and humanity is a single whole. This requires a new level of cooperative leadership, trust building, and commitment. We embrace this challenge. So they didn't come out and agree on a single solution, but they agreed to work the problem. Of course, the pandemic has changed things a lot. In many, like the whole economics of the world has changed. So we'll see what happens this year. But I want to point out that is Darren Woods, CEO of Exxon, and 10,000 people work for Exxon in the Woodlands. So we have a local representative there. So with benefits, and I'm just going to quickly go through this, but per the economists, it's an effective way to do it. Our bill is bipartisan. It's good for people. I think we can kind of go back to Matt's presentation last month. You reduce the consumption of carbon fuels and you improve the air quality. It's good for the economy. This is a equitable way to shift over time to a greener sources of power. It's revenue neutral. It doesn't grow government. And by the way, our church supports it. So I'm just going to finish by saying your voice matters. Learn about the issue, get involved. The impact on you and future generations is large. There's no question about that. And consider Catholic social justice. Climate change is going to impact everyone. It will harm the poor the most. Talk to friends and family. Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, said, thoughtful dialogue is the only path for making progress and developing solutions. And that's what he was saying is, if you're on the far right and the far left yelling at each other, you're not getting anywhere and you're not accomplishing anything. That's not the place to be. Being reasonable and being in the middle is where people need to be talking. And consider carbon pricing, supported by the Pope and leading economists. And once again, what they said was it's the most cost-effective means to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed necessary. So to conclude here, CCL founder, his name's Marshall Saunders. He just recently passed away. I was fortunate enough to meet him. He's a great man. He said, ordinary people like you and me have to organize, educate ourselves, give up our hopelessness and powerlessness, and gain the skills to be effective with our government. So if you ever asked me 5 years ago, 4 years ago, whether I'd be doing what I'm doing now, I'd tell you we're crazy. But it's possible. I mean, well, I am crazy, but it is possible. You can consider joining CCL. If not CCL, I would say just get involved. So if you want to look into CCL, you can just text the word join to that phone number. And I'll be sending out notes after this, so you don't necessarily have to write it down. And there's a lot of really great references out there, and I'll put this also out there later. So yeah, that's it. So, any questions?